Notes for solving absolute value equations. Definition of absolute value. When you take the absolute value of a number, you are determining the distance from 0. So the absolute value of 6 is 6 because 6 is 6 units away from 0. Negative 6 is equal to 6 because negative 6 is 6 units away from 0. Okay, and we can see that here. 0 to negative 6 is 6 units, and 0 to positive 6 is 6 units. When you think of absolute value, you need to think of distance. Okay. If we know that the absolute value of x is equal to 5, then that means x is equal to 5 and x is equal to negative 5, since they are both 5 units away from 0. Since we're thinking of distance, you need to remember that absolute value cannot equal a negative number because there's no such thing as a negative distance. Absolute value equations can have 2, 1, or no solutions. When solving absolute value equations, we're going to follow these steps. We're first going to isolate the absolute value. Okay, so we're going to make sure that there's nothing on the outside of the absolute value bars. We're then going to split the absolute values into two equations, one equal to the positive and one equal to the negative. And then we're going to solve the two equations individually. So looking at example 1, we have the absolute value of r plus 4 is equal to 1. This absolute value is already by itself, so that means we are going to create our two equations. We have r plus 4 equals 1 and r plus 4 equals negative 1. And then we're going to solve for r separately. So subtracting 4, I get r is equal to 1 minus 4, which is negative 3. And then subtracting 4, I get r is equal to negative 1 minus 4, which is negative 5. So this absolute value equation has two possible answers. Number 2. Notice here that our absolute value bar is no longer isolated. We have a negative 2 on the outside being multiplied, and then we have a 5 on the other side being added. So we need to first get rid of those before we can split our absolute value into two equations. So I'm going to subtract 5 first, and then I have negative 2 absolute value, negative 2m plus 10 is equal to negative 32. Then I'm going to divide both sides by negative 2, and I have absolute value of negative 2m plus 10 is equal to 16. And then now that my absolute value is by itself, I can create my two separate equations. So I have negative 2m plus 10 is equal to positive 16, and negative 2m plus 10 is equal to negative 16. Solving for m, I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides, and I get negative 2m is equal to 6. Divide by negative 2, and I get m is equal to negative 3. On the other side, I'm going to subtract 10, and I get negative 2m is equal to negative 26. Divided by negative 2, I get m is equal to 13. Okay, so again here, I had two possible answers. Okay. Looking at example 3, first I need to isolate my absolute value. So I need to get rid of the plus 2 and the negative 3. I'm going to do that by subtracting 2 from both sides, and I get negative 3 absolute value of 3/7 x minus 9 is equal to 15. And then I'm going to divide both sides by negative 3, and I get the absolute value of 3/7 x minus 9 is equal to negative 5. So notice how I have my absolute value isolated. However, I have an absolute value equal to a negative number. Remember, absolute value can never equal a negative number. So for this case, there is no solution. Okay, this next section, we're going to look at absolute value equations with extraneous solutions. An extraneous solution is an apparent solution that must be rejected because it does not satisfy the original equation. Okay, this usually happens when there's an x on both sides or we have two sets of absolute values equal to each other. So all this means is that we're going to have one extra step. We're going to have to plug in the x value that we find to make sure we get a true statement. If we get a false statement, then that answer is not correct, and we have to check the other to see if it could work. So for number 4, we have the absolute value of 4x plus 10 is equal to 6x. So we're first checking that our absolute value is by itself, which it is. Since it's by itself, I can go ahead and write my two equations. So I have 4x plus 10 equals 6x, and 4x plus 10 equals negative 6x. Solving for x, I'm going to subtract 4x, and I get 10 is equal to 2x. Divide by 2, and I get x is equal to 5, so there's one possible answer. On the other side, I'm going to subtract 4x, and I get 10 is equal to negative 10x. Divide both sides by negative 10, and I get x is equal to negative 1, another possible answer. Before I decide if these answers are correct, I'm going to then check each of them. So I'm going to check when x is equal to 5, and then I'm going to check when x is equal to negative 1. So in my original problem, I am going to plug in 5 for x. So let me rewrite my original problem first. So I have the absolute value of 4x plus 10 is equal to 6x. And where I see an x, I'm going to put a 5. So absolute value of 4 times 5 plus 10 is equal to 6 times 5. 4 times 5 is 20. 20 plus 10 is 30. So I have the absolute value of 30 is equal to 30, which means I have 30 equals to 30. So that's a true statement. And now I'm going to check when x is negative 1. So I have the absolute value of 4 times negative 1 plus 10 is equal to 6 times negative 1. Well, simplifying this, 4 times negative 1 is negative 4, so negative 4 plus 10 is equal to negative 6. Then I have absolute value of 6 is equal to negative 6. 6 is equal to negative 6, which is a false statement. So that means x equal to negative 1 cannot be an answer, and the only answer that I have for this problem is the x equals 5. Okay, let's look at example 5. Same thing again. We're first trying to isolate our absolute value. And in order to do that, we're going to have to get rid of that negative 4. So I'm going to do that by dividing everything by negative 4. Okay. So I have absolute value of 2x plus 3 is equal to 3x plus 2. Negative 12x divided by negative 4 is 3x. Negative 8 divided by negative 4 is 2. Okay. So now I have my absolute value isolated. Now I'm going to write my two equations. So I have 2x plus 3 is equal to 3x plus 2, and 2x plus 3 is equal to negative 3x plus 2. Notice how I had more than one term on my right side, which means I had to put it in parentheses before I wrote the negative in the front because the entire thing is going to be negative, not just the first term. So solving for x, I'm going to subtract 2x, and I get 3 is equal to x plus 2. Then I'm going to subtract 2, and I get x is equal to 1, so that's one possible answer. On the other side, I need to first distribute the negative, so I have 2x plus 3 is equal to negative 3x minus 2. I'm going to add the 3x to the other side, and I get 5x plus 3 equals negative 2. I'm going to subtract the 3, and I get 5x is equal to negative 5, which means I get x is equal to negative 1. So another possible answer. But before I can say this is my answer, I need to check both x equals 1 and x equals negative 1. So first I'm checking x equals 1. So I'm going to rewrite my problem, but instead of x, I'm going to write a 1. So negative 4 absolute value of 2 times 1 plus 3 is equal to negative 12 times 1 minus 8. So I'm left with negative 4 absolute value 5 is equal to negative 12 minus 8. So this is negative 20 is equal to negative 20, which is a true statement. So far x equals 1 is a solution. Now I'm going to check x equals negative 1. So I have negative 4 absolute value 2 times negative 1 plus 3 is equal to negative 12 times negative 1 minus 8. So I have negative 4 absolute value of 2 times negative 1, which is negative 2, plus 3, which is 1, is equal to 12 minus 8. So we have negative 4 is equal to 4, which is a false statement. So that tells us x equals negative 1 is not an answer, and our only answer here is x equals 1. Now let's look at examples where we have an absolute value equal to another absolute value. When you have this happen, you are going to choose one of them to be your absolute value. Okay, so I'm just choosing this one. Now that I've noticed my absolute value is isolated, I'm going to do the exact same thing and split it into two equations. So I have x plus 5 is equal to x plus 11, and then x plus 5 is equal to negative x plus 11. Okay, notice again how when I made the other side negative, I put the entire expression in parentheses because that whole thing is negative, not just the first term. Okay, then I'm going to solve for x. So on the first one, when I subtract x, I get 5 is equal to 11, which is a false statement. So this one doesn't have a solution. Now I'm going to do the other one. I have x plus 5 is equal to negative x minus 11. I distributed the negative. So adding the x to the other side, I get 2x plus 5 is equal to negative 11. Subtracting 5, I get 2x is equal to negative 16. Dividing by 2, I get x is equal to negative 8. Okay, so it looks like here my only possible answer choice is that negative 8, but I'm still going to check to see if I'm going to get a true statement. So I have the absolute value of negative 8 plus 5 is equal to the absolute value of negative 8 plus 11. Okay, so that gives me negative 8 plus 5 is negative 3, so the absolute value of negative 3 is equal to negative 8 plus 11, which is absolute value of 3, so 3 equals 3 is a true statement, which means x equals negative 8 is a possible answer choice. Okay, last one here with number 7. Again, since we have an absolute value equal to another absolute value, we're just going to choose one of them to be the absolute value. So 2x minus 1 is going to be my absolute value. Since it's already isolated, then I'm going to write my two equations. So I have 2x minus 1 equals x plus 7, and 2x minus 1 equals negative x plus 7. Again, notice how I put the negative on the outside and I put the term in parentheses. Solving for x, I'm going to subtract x from both sides and I get x minus 1 equals 7. Adding 1 to both sides, I get x is equal to 8. So one possible answer. And then on the other side, I'm going to distribute that negative. So I have 2x minus 1 is equal to negative x minus 7. Adding x to both sides, I get 3x minus 1 is equal to negative 7. Adding 1 to the other side, I get 3x is equal to negative 6. Dividing by 3, I get x is equal to negative 2. Before I can figure out which one is my answer, I first need to check each one separately. So I'm going to check x equals 8 first. So I have the absolute value of 2 times 8 minus 1 is equal to absolute value of 8 plus 7. 2 times 8 is 16. 16 minus 1 is 15. So I have the absolute value of 15 is equal to the absolute value of 15, which is true. So this is a possible answer. Now I'm going to check x equals negative 2. So I have the absolute value of 2 times negative 2 minus 1 is equal to the absolute value of negative 2 plus 7. 2 times negative 2 is negative 4. Negative 4 minus 1 is negative 5. So I have the absolute value of negative 5 is equal to the absolute value of 5, because negative 2 plus 7 is 5. So I get 5 is equal to 5, which again is a true statement. So x equals negative 2 is also a possible answer.